thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Shawnee Samu Johnson. I work at Center for Civic Design. And at Center for Civic Design, we work with election offices, advocates, and other organizations that are similar to us to make elections easier and more accessible for everybody. I'm a civic designer and researcher at CCD. I wear a lot of hats, and one of the hats I wear is that I lead our work on forms. And so today, I want to talk about this research project that we've been working on, in which we set out to learn what it's like for screen reader users to fill out web and PDF forms. So I led the work in the design and the research. Besides forms, I also am the plain language lead. So my background's in plain language and linguistics. And I do a lot of other work in research and design and elections. I was also helped out a lot by my colleague, Lynn Baumeister, and she's worked in making elections accessible. She's done a lot of work on that. Okay, so there are a lot of different types of assistive technology, and you might wonder why screen readers. We wanted to test with screen readers for a couple reasons. Probably the most important one is that it's probably the most widely used type of assistive technology. If you've done any work in accessibility, it's probably the one you think of first. There are a lot of complex and technical requirements. There are little quirks that you just need to know about different types of screen readers. And because of the complexities and the technical nature of it, screen reader support tends to be bad, or a lot of things tend to get missed, whether that's at the web level or PDF level. And there's a big diversity in technology. There are a lot of different types of programs that people use as screen readers. These are the big three. NVDA and JAWS are the Windows-based ones, and Mac VoiceOver is the Mac OS-based one. And besides that, there are many other types of programs that people use as screen readers, but these are kind of the big three that you'll come across the most. And so what we wanted to learn, we wanted to approach this from a number of ways. This was my first experience and CCD's first experience doing usability testing with screen reader users. So we kind of approached it from like a mixed usability testing and expert interview point of view. We had three major goals. The first one was to spend time watching screen reader users navigate a website on elections. We did that to get a baseline of how they use a screen reader. And so we use that to conduct the usability testing session, and we wanted to understand what methods and strategies that screen reader users use to fill out forms. And then finally, we followed up with a conversation where we talked about attitudes towards screen readers, PDF forms in general, web forms, and also elections. We tested two things. The first thing we tested was the vote.gov voter registration web form filler. So vote.gov created this thing called a form filler. It's a web form that then populates a PDF that the user would then print out and mail in or email in, or whatever method that the state allows. We, of course, didn't have them print out the form. We had them just use the form filler. And there's a unique form filler for every state because every state has unique requirements. And we wanted to start here because the form filler was built specifically for screen reader support. There's a section on the website that talks about the steps that they took to make the form filler accessible to screen readers. And then the second thing we tested was the Colorado voter registration PDF form. This was a form that we designed for the state of Colorado. It passes PDF UA and all other accessibility requirements. And so yeah. Let's see. There's another session going on right now that it's called like Goodbye Paper Forms or something, which I really wanted to visit. And I want to say that like I share that mentality that PDF forms are not great. But there are a number of reasons why we need to keep thinking about design in elections specifically, but probably broadly across the government, for why we need to continue to think about PDF form design. They're usually required by law, so every state, again, has their own laws, but usually there's a requirement that PDF forms have to be available. There are still seven states that don't have online voter registration options, so paper forms are still the only option for voters in those states. Of course, the digital divide remains, although it seems to be closing. There are still millions of Americans that don't have reliable access to broadband. Some people prefer paper, whether it's like, people who are used to that medium, or for voter registration drives, they're very useful to have like a physical copy. And because they're kind of seen as like second to things like online voter registration, they usually have a lot of usability and accessibility issues. So we see it as like, an imperative to make these things better. And I want to reiterate that I'm not like a PDF evangelist. We see there are a lot of issues with the format. In general, we support good policies that make access to elections easier. So whether that's online voter registration or automatic voter registration, we like streamlined elections, but not every state has these options. So our view is that in the meantime, we need to improve what we have. So like I said, we did kind of like a hybrid expert interview and a traditional usability testing approach. We had specific criteria for testing or for recruitment. We wanted to test with people basically who rely heavily on a screen reader. So that means that they're usually low vision or who are blind. And we wanted to do this on a computer, not a tablet or a phone that presents a whole different set of usability issues. So we wanted to start with computers. We also wanted to start with what we're calling power users, people who are not only adept at using screen readers, but who can explain like their approach and explain other things that they've experienced, whether it's through their own experience or things that they've seen with other screen reader users. And then, of course, related to that, if they're familiar with multiple screen readers, that was nice to be able to switch. Let's see. Just a small note about remote testing with screen reader users. This was our first experience, so that's my colleague Lynn and I. This is just a small list of questions that you need to ask before you start testing, and things we kind of learned on the fly, but worth kind of going over very quickly. Basically, you should have a plan. You should, these are just a couple of questions you need to ask, like, how are you going to share, get them to share their audio? How are they going to share their screen? If you need to share files and URLs, how are you going to do that? Are you going to do it in the chat or the email? And the screen reader speed, the speed at which the screen reader announces what they're seeing on the screen, needs to be understandable to the moderator. So having them adjust the speed to something that's somewhere in between, like what we would find comfortable and what works for the participant. So just a couple things to think about, but there are many, many more things that are many more questions you should be asking. So these were the big picture takeaways of what we learned. I'll say that none of these are huge surprises. All the really interesting things were in the details that we learned that I'll go over in the following slides. But of course, there's extreme variation among screen reader users. A a lot of different like strategies, their habits, and their personalities. And you know, the personalities part of it was very interesting, like how frustrated they get or how kind of tenacious they are, how many different strategies they try. All of these things affect your experience and whether you're able to fill out a form. Again, this is like a classic usability thing. There are many different types of issues. Some are critical, some are annoying. Enough of the annoying issues will, prevent you from filling out the form, but often one critical error or critical issue will prevent you from following through. And then the final thing is that PDF and web accessibility is very delicate. It often doesn't take much for somebody's experience to get completely derailed. And this is with, quote unquote, power users. So while we knew this going into it, it was also humbling to see. Okay, I'm going to give a very quick primer on how a screen reader works. This is just the very tip of the iceberg, but I think it'll be enough to understand the things that we learn. So the primary way that a screen reader organizes information is through something called tags. And basically, what a screen reader is doing is that it's replicating a sighted user's experience. And so when I'm a sighted user, so if I'm reading a newspaper, I know when I'm seeing a headline because it's bigger and it's bolder. If I'm on a web page, I know that there's a link. It's underlined and maybe in a different color. Buttons look like pill-shaped buttons. And so I take all of these visual cues to organize the information and make decisions. But the way a screen reader user does that is that it announces the tag that's associated with that content. So in this example, I would see how to return your ballot. I know that's a heading, it's bigger, it's bolder. And then by mail and in person, I know that's a list because there are bullets. But a screen reader user hears, some version of this, depending on what the screen reader is and how their settings are set, something like heading level 2, how to return your ballot, list with 2 items, list item 1, and so on. And so this is kind of the basic of how a screen reader uses tags. You've probably heard the phrase tags a lot. The other important thing I wanted to go over is tooltips. Tooltips aren't exactly the same for PDF and web, so this is more so true for PDF forms, but basically in PDF forms, tooltips are kind of like alt text for forms. And when I say form, I mean like any interactive part of the form. So a text field, a radio button, a checkbox, anything that you input information into. And each form needs to have a tooltip because screen reader users will use this mode called forms mode. And they're not reading everything on the form. They're only jumping from form to form and hearing the tooltip that's associated with it. So like alt text, it needs to be descriptive, short, and not like referencing other things on the form that would make it like a hindrance to understand. So in this example, the tooltip for that checkbox, same as section 4, wouldn't be a descriptive tooltip because they don't know what section 4 is. They only jumped from form to form. So same as section 4 they're like, what is section 4? So something more along the lines of same as residence address. And then that, of course, means that you have to be very deliberate about the tooltips for each of those forms above, making sure that they know what the residence address is. So tip of the iceberg, but I think enough to understand what we learned. And so there are 6 main ways that we observed people scanning for information. Linear is like looking kind of word by word, line by line. Headings, jumping from heading to heading. Forms mode, I just explained. You can have it show you all the links on a page, like a list of the links. Same with buttons. You can say like, I want to see every button on the page. And then finally, you can search. So people had, like I said, a variety of different ways that they would approach getting their information. Rarely people went through every single, in fact, never do people go like this. But it's just to say that people use like a variety of strategies. Most people scan something like this, where they would start in one strategy, jump to another one, maybe read a little bit, maybe jump to another strategy, and then jump back. Some people just had two or even just one strategy, and they would just bounce back and forth between them. One participant described this as having a plan A, B, and C. Some participants had plans A, B, C, D, and E, and some participants just had plan A. And so this kind of just barely scratches the surface about what I meant about the diversity in how people use a screen reader. And all of these things, like I said, contribute to how their experiences with filling out a form. Okay, so I'm going to go through some of the things that we learned during testing. A lot of the issues that we found are things that are pretty common usability issues. So you might be familiar with them, but what I hope to highlight is how these issues are often made worse for screen reader users. Okay, so on the web form, we sent them to the landing page for the form filler, and we wanted them to find the form filler. So they found this button on the left. It says, fill out the registration form online using the form filler tool. Okay, so that they go to the next page. Many of them went straight into forms mode because they're expecting a form. And they find a form. It's the confirm eligibility checkbox. So they check it. They're still in forms mode, and they're looking for another form. But there are no more forms on this page. So now they're essentially lost. So they go back up to the top, they read more of the information, they're moving around different strategies. Eventually they get to the button. Okay, it says continue to the digital form filler on vote.gov. So now they expect more forms because that's what the button says. And so they get to this page and there are no forms now. And so eventually they realize that there's a button. It says begin new registration. So the recommendation here being something like saying form only when it's imminent. There are probably a lot of ways to accomplish that, but being very deliberate with how you use that language. A related problem, so if you remember from that third page, once people finally got to this page, they're now in buttons mode, and so they're jumping from button to button. They know that they need to start from scratch with the new registration. They're not updating their registration information, so they're in buttons mode. They get to a button that says begin new registration. Well, some participants hear that and they think like, leave this process and go to a new registration. And so, that language, it makes sense to me as a sighted user because I see that there's this like binary between these two options. The visual design, the information design are all giving me visual cues, but to a screen reader user, they're just hearing begin new registration. It's very misleading. So using language that's process appropriate. And I think the bigger picture guidance for the last two slides here is, using language more intentionally, which sometimes is difficult to do if you're not a screen reader user, which is why you should test with screen reader users. Early validation, something that I just heard in a previous talk, very annoying. So you need to type in a phone number. It needs 10 digits for the phone number. So immediately type in one digit and it barks at you, 10-digit number required. So as a sighted user, this is pretty annoying to me. It's visually, distracting, but I can get through it. But for a screen reader user, it's especially annoying because for every time they type a digit, it announces that error. So when it announces that error, they're trying to hear the number that they just typed. Screen reader users have to like scan what they just typed often because they can't glance at the whole thing. So there's like competing screen reader voices, and so this is another example of something that's mildly annoying to a sighted user, very annoying to a screen reader user. Error on the topic of error messages. So if we see here, it asks for your month, day, and year of your date of birth. So you type in 4696. Okay, it says the error says this field is required. Enter your birth month in the form of a number between 1 and 12. Well, they go back and they review what they typed in. It says 4. That is a number between 1 and 12. And so this one was interesting to me because, like, as a sighted user, I might type this in and just see that there was an error, and then glance up and see the helper text MMDDYYYY, and I probably wouldn't even read the error. I would just, try the format that it says above. But if they're reading this error and it's incorrect, then they're wondering what they did wrong. So easy recommendation, use more accurate descriptive error messages. Progress bars are, of course, very common, and things that require like special usability and accessibility considerations. This progress bar, it wasn't tagged, or it wasn't clear to our participants that this was a progress bar. They'd get to this page and hear personal information, address, and location, and they're thinking, what is that? What is that telling me? Again, as a sighted user, I'm seeing this. I'm seeing that it's blue. That indicates that that's my current position. I can see that it's spanning across the page. I immediately recognize that as a progress bar. So there are many best practices for indicating progress. You could even just call it a progress bar. That might help. You could make these headings. You could indicate the current position in text. So following best practices for indicating progress and being very cognizant about how a screen reader user is going to encounter this. Indicating which forms are required is a very interesting thing, especially with PDF forms. So I was under the impression that setting the checkbox required would be enough to like indicate that it's required. But I was wrong. So of course, saying that it's required, being explicit, using the language that it's required on top of setting the required settings, in this case it's Acrobat, seems like a easy fix. This was another interesting thing that we came across. So we were putting instructions first because we want people to read the instructions. But if you think back to that list of all of the different strategies, pretty much all of them except forms mode would force you to read the instructions first. So we don't want to force anybody to read instructions. We want them to be available for when people want them or need them. But if they're forced to read through all the instructions, they know it's a form, but they're like, where's the form stuff? And unless they're in forms mode, they're going to be forced to read the instructions. So swapping the instructions with the form, again, an easy fix for PDF forms. Tooltips, like I said, this came up very often. What we heard a lot was, I just want the description of what I'm supposed to put in. I don't want an example. So they'd hear like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0 or something like that. And it doesn't immediately register to a screen reader user. To me, it might, because I see the parentheses and the hyphen, but most screen readers don't announce like punctuation. So they're just hearing a string of numbers. So using a descriptive tooltip, 10-digit phone number, last 4 digits of your social security number, things like that. Another tooltip issue we found, we use initialisms to save space on paper forms. Space is very finite on a form, but like I can see CO, and if I'm from Colorado, I know what that means. I know DL is driver's license, but some screen readers will try to like spell out this initialism, so it'll read something like co-dul number, and they don't know what that is. It sounds like nonsense to them. So in the tooltip, at least, spelling it out as enter Colorado driver's license number. Another tooltip problem, just like every other type of user, screen reader users can be very impatient. So often they'll just skip forward, like once they get the gist or what they think is the gist of the tooltip. So they'd hear in this top tooltip, city or town of address, where they're like, okay, I'm going to put my address. And then they get down here to the other mailing address, and they hear city or town or address where you currently receive. And they're like, well, I just put in my city or town. Why am I putting in this information twice? And it's because that distinguishing information is at the end, and they didn't actually get to it because it's buried at the end of the tooltip. So some version of front loading this important information, the important and distinguishing information, so that people can get that information quickly. And this is, like in information architecture principle, you want to put the most important information at the top so that they get it first. Okay, great. So that is it for the things that we learned. As far as why we are doing this type of research, of course, for all the reasons I mentioned, but there are a lot of forms in elections. I did some back of the napkin math, and it's tens of thousands of forms. Besides voter registration forms, you have, non-voter facing forms. So for candidates and poll workers, there's everything that it takes to run an election, candidacy filing, of course, election day needs, ballot question petitions. It's a lot of forms, and we're a small team of, I think, 16. So we can't make all of those forms. Right. And not to mention that, elections in the United States are decentralized. So not only 50 states, but in some states, elections are run at the county or the municipal level. So needless to say, it's a lot of forms. And so what we want to do is we want to make a really good workflow for making forms. And what we often see is something like this. They design something in Microsoft Word. They do what's called accessibility remediation, which is like layering over the accessibility work. And then they publish the form. And let's assume that they got everything right in the remediation. Well, now if they have to do edits, they have to go back to the original form. In most cases, you might be able to do some edits in Acrobat, but in most cases, you have to go back to the source file, you export it again, and all your accessibility work is lost. And so we have been working on this type of workflow, which is often called Born Accessible, where you're doing the accessibility work in the source file. In our case, it's in InDesign. And then you do some of the touch-up work in Acrobat. So you're doing the stuff that you can't do in InDesign, and you're checking your work, essentially. So you publish the form, and when you make edits, you make the edits in InDesign, and you're about 90% of the way done there. So we've been working on this type of workflow a lot, and we want to make this accessible to elections offices. So we've been working on a toolkit. The toolkit basically helps elections offices use a Born Accessible workflow, and the toolkit includes kind of high-level guidance on form design, things about like information design and information hierarchy, and 2 InDesign templates. There's now step-by-step technical guidance on how to do PDF accessibility, and then accessibility checklist. And that just went on our website, I think, yesterday. So if you're interested in that, please check it out. It's at civicdesign.org. And if you want to follow up with any questions, I'm always happy to take questions by email. So that's it. I think we're gonna get to some questions now.
Not a problem. I can read out some of the questions that we've got. I'm just going to go in order. So the first was from Meredith Matthews. How representative of the total screen reader user base are power users? Is the average screen reader user pretty expert at the software, or is there a significant skill gap?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I would say probably not mostly power users. One thing I mentioned is that we want to continue this research. And so that's another reason why we started with power users. We want to work with people at multiple skill levels. Maybe somebody else has some insight about whether they know like the range in skill, but I'm not sure exactly.
Great. Well, I encourage folks to reply to Meredith's question if you also have ideas. Another question we received is it enough to just have an asterisk at each field to say it's required with a description at the top of the form, or should each field have a text label with required?
That's another good question that came up. I've heard both. I've heard that asterisk can often mean required, and screen reader users just have learned that that's the case. I've also heard that best practices state that saying required is the safest choice. I think that like this is why we do usability testing, because often the best practices might not cover cases or people who are new to screen readers. The pathway to using a screen reader is so different for everybody. Some people lose their vision over several decades. Some people lose their vision in a traumatic accident. Some people are blind from birth. And so we can't expect that they're all going to just know what the best practices are. So for me, at this point, like I would err on the side of writing that it's required. It seems like the safer choice. But yeah, good question, and one that I would like to continue to investigate the answer to.
Great. Next question is from Carla. Can I ask why the preference for source files is InDesign over Word or a PDF format or a PDF form?
So the question is why use InDesign over Microsoft Word?
Yes.
I think this slide, am I still sharing?
I am not seeing your presentation.
It's okay. Basically it's that you really can't do what we're calling a born accessible workflow from Microsoft Word. There are some kind of changes. I'm starting to see some changes in Microsoft's approach. I think, there was just this big announcement about color contrast. So it's nice to see that it's being taken more seriously, but it's a struggle, basically, that designing forms in Microsoft Word, it's easier from the start. Anyone can kind of sit down and draw out, do underscores for lines and stuff, but making that truly accessible is so much more work in the end. And not to mention the issue that I mentioned, that you have to redo the accessibility work, or at least most of it. In Acrobat, you have to do what's called remediation. And remediation is something you want to avoid. It's a huge hassle. It prevents you from, iterating on your design. It's just a big barrier in the design process. So while we understand, like, InDesign is a pretty advanced program, what we're hoping is that, a little bit of InDesign homework before using our toolkit will get you most of the way to understanding it. And for reference, I did not come into working in elections with a design background. I started from a plain language background. And so I think that it's one of those things that I've learned to be kind of more convinced that InDesign is like unfortunately, the only really good program you could use to make truly accessible PDF forms.
Excellent. We have about 3 more questions. Just encourage folks to add any questions you're holding on to under the Q&A feature. Next question is from Christina. Can you go over again why setting expectations early is a problem for screen reader users?
It's not in itself a problem. It's that for a screen reader user, they're taking every piece of information in linearly. So when they're expecting a form to be on the next page, they will often enter this forms mode. And for forms mode, it only wants to find forms, form fields, checkboxes, and things like that. So if you set them up to expect that and they enter forms mode, the number of things that goes through their head of why am I not seeing a form? Was it not programmed correctly? Are there forms, but I just can't see them because the web designer didn't know? Or are there no forms on this page? So setting expectations early, it's not that setting expectations early is the problem. It's that you have to be very intentional about what expectations you're setting people up for. And this is also true of sighted users. We see this in like when we work with elections offices on mailings, we have to think about the timing for when we want to send out mailings that have to do with like vote by mail envelopes. So if we send out, you're going to receive your absentee ballot in 9 months, they're going to forget that. They're not going to remember that information. So I think maybe the better guidance is being very intentional about when you're giving the information so that they're primed to use that information in the right way. I hope that answers that question. I'm not sure it does.
Thanks. Next question is from Billy. How many of these PDF features are unique to Adobe Acrobat? And are there other offline form-based tools that support filling out forms?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question. How many features are unique to Acrobat for filling out a form?
Yes. Billy, feel free to reply and clarify, but how many of the PDF features are unique just to Adobe Acrobat? And are there other kind of form-based tools that support filling out forms? And are any of those tools like offline tools?
I see. Well, it's hard to answer. Billy, if you want to email me, and I'd love to follow up with that question because I'm curious what you're getting at with the question. But so one thing I will mention is that, again, PDF support is very poor. Like if you try to fill out a PDF with different browsers, they handle them very differently. A lot of screen readers just know that you have to use Acrobat. It's just like, again, this unfortunately the only thing that really works if you need to fill out a PDF. So I think that the answer is that unfortunately we are stuck with these tools for now. At the designer's end using InDesign, and at the user's end for using Acrobat. But yeah, Billy, if you want to follow up with me on that, I'm happy to chat more about that.
Awesome. I know we are almost at time and there are still more questions coming in. Um, Sean, maybe before we end, will you be planning to share your slides from today? I think there were a couple of requests coming in,
I
folks
can.
interested.
Should I? Yeah, I can follow up with you. Yeah, I was just working on them until pretty recently. So yes, I'm happy to share them.
Great. And then for folks who are on the call asking for slides, you can come back to the resource hub at the end of the event. And you will see the slides from today in there. Great. Excellent. Maybe one last question. Is there a couple of questions in actually coming from Tora and Ashley just around do you have any best practices or is there like a resource with all of the best practices that folks can reference when designing their own forms?
Yeah, so I finally got to the QA. I'm sorry, I was on the event tab. PDF UA is probably the standard that people think of the most. Of course, there's also WCAG and Section 508 in the United States. But so what we're trying to do with our toolkit is kind of dispel that. If you went to the PDF UA guidelines and like read through them, you are not familiar with how to accomplish that, you'd be so stuck. That's where I was, and that's why we developed this toolkit. What we're hoping is that we can get election officers much closer to being something like PDF UA compliant. We know that it's very difficult to become 100% compliant with these different standards. But what we're hoping is that the toolkit that we made is going to get you much closer. And so the template includes a lot of that stuff that you don't have to do from scratch. So yeah, not a great answer in 1 minute, but I appreciate that question and something that's like the driving force. We're like, how do we get people to make better forms? Not perfect, but better.
Excellent. And it looks like Sarah also dropped a resource in chat from Civic Design as well around creating accessible forms for print and PDF.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, that is the toolkit we just updated. So we'd love to hear from people. If you work in elections, if you design forms, if you use the toolkit, please reach out to us. I'd love to hear your feedback. And yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think that is all of the time that we have for today's session. Sean, thank you so much for such an engaging and performative presentation. Thank you all.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for joining.